to me is he straight out racist. The sucker was simple.
Make some records that people like, but make a couple records that some shit hate. And Cube took it to the hill.
$500 per day on coke and crack.
Flavor Flav, the fearsome beast of Public Enemy. A razor-sharp mind. A rebellious name bold enough to stab straight into Hollywood's forbidden zone. A black icon who never bowed down. But just as everything hit its peak, the lights, the roaring crowds, revenues in the tens of millions of dollars, his career suddenly collapsed. The reason was far from simple. 18 years drowned in addiction pushed him to the very edge of ruin. 43 times on the police radar, 90 days locked behind bars. A dispute with Chuck D made Public Enemy turn their backs all at once. All of it turned Flavor Flav into a man Hollywood wanted to erase forever. The truth behind Flavor Flav's disappearance is darker than you imagine. Don't look away. Everything is about to be exposed right now. A rebellious musical genius Flavor. Flav's real name is William Jonathan Drayton Jr., born on March 16, 1959 in Roosevelt, New York, and raised in Freeport not far from the town of Hempstead. This was a relatively affluent area, but Flavor was not born into luxury. He is cousins with rappers Old Dirty Bastard GZA and RZA of the Wu-Tang Clan. It can be said that talent and brilliance already ran through the veins of this family line. His father, William Drayton Sr., owned and operated the Soul Diner, a restaurant serving traditional African-American cuisine. This business allowed the family to maintain a stable working-class merchant status with a clear voice and presence in the community. At the same time, his mother was a singer. According to Flavor Flav, she was a classical concert pianist, meaning not merely an amateur, but someone with formal academic-level technique. It can be said that his mother was an endless source of inspiration on his musical path. He once shared with People magazine in 2008, "I really want to thank my mother for sacrificing everything for me." At 5 years old, William Drayton Jr. taught himself to play the piano. In the early years of elementary school, the boy had already mastered not only piano, but also drums and guitar, all through self-exploration, without any formal training. That was an ability far beyond the norm. However, that childhood was not sheltered by music alone. When he was very young, Flavor Flav accidentally set his family's house on fire while playing with a lighter. The incident has haunted him ever since because he nearly took his parents' lives. By the time he entered elementary school, he developed a clear pattern of delinquent behavior, petty theft, snatching, breaking, and entering. Biographical sources bluntly describe him as having few friends and being especially good at getting into trouble. He was in and out of jail repeatedly for various robberies. Eventually, he dropped out of school in the 11th grade. Despite all of this, there was one very unusual thing. Flavor Flav's parents did not completely abandon him after the arson, did not discard him after repeated arrests, and did not hesitate to support him in continuing his education even after he dropped out of high school. After leaving high school, he did not immediately dive into music. He enrolled at Adelphi University on Long Island, where he met Carlton Ridenour, later known to the world as Chuck D. Before that, Flavor Flav had even briefly attended culinary school. When he met Chuck D, the two co-hosted a hip-hop radio show at the university and began rapping together. They soon realized that if they truly committed to this path, success was entirely possible. Reality later proved them right. Drayton used to draw graffiti signing his pieces with the name Flavor Flav, and when he needed a stage name, that fateful name officially came to life. The birth of the name Public Enemy and the unforeseen consequences. In 1985, Flavor Flav and Chuck D laid the foundation for the birth of Public Enemy, with Flavor Flav serving as the hype man. 1 year later, they released their debut track Public Enemy No. 1, and with just that single recording, the entire industry was forced to pay attention. The song quickly caught the eye of Rick Rubin, then CEO of Def Jam, who was searching for the next figure who could shape mainstream hip-hop. Rubin arranged a private meeting with the group, and it was there that a major risk first surfaced. Rubin did not understand who Flavor Flav was within that artistic structure. In his eyes, Chuck D was the intellect, the voice, the center. Flav was seen as expendable. His style was humorous and exaggerated, completely opposite to the seriousness rising in hip-hop at the time. Rubin wanted to sign Chuck D as a solo artist, but Chuck D refused. He firmly declared that he would not accept a solo deal without Flavor Flav. In the end, Rubin agreed. And in 1986, both Flavor Flav and Chuck D signed with Def Jam Records. This moment marked Flavor Flav's official entry into the music industry. Public Enemy changed everything for African Americans. They made revolutionary thought mainstream. They contributed to the momentum of the Million Man March. They made red, black, green worn around the neck instead of gold chains. They did it all, and they were truly great. Flavor Flav quickly became the most beloved face among the public. The oversized clock, the flashy outfits, the explosive performances made him impossible to confuse with anyone else. But that very thing turned him into a thorn in the side of many record executives. They believed Flav was too much too foolish for a group carrying a serious political message. They wanted him toned down, shaped to fit the mold. Flavor Flav did not comply. He chose to remain himself. As pressure mounted, Flavor Flav temporarily stepped away from music and entered television. He appeared on VH1's The Surreal Life, where he met Bridget Nielsen. Their strange relationship quickly captured public curiosity. They went on to have their own show called Strange Love, following two people who seemed utterly incompatible. When the show ended, they split up, and Bridget returned to Europe with her former fiancé. Flavor Flav continued with Flavor of Love, a dating show that seemed like a joke but shattered VH1 ratings records. Season 2 reached 7.5 million viewers, the highest figure in the network's history. But behind that glow, Flavor Flav's personal life began to unravel, opening a chain of scandals powerful enough to threaten erasing every legacy he had built. A chaotic private life and legal downfall. Flavor Flav's addiction began forming in the early to mid-1980s, precisely when Public Enemy was born and rapidly achieved its first commercial success. At the time, he was in his late 20s, an age when biologically the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and behavioral restraint should have fully matured. But biological maturity does not equal personal maturity. Flavor Flav openly admitted that he had a lot of money, and that money combined with a peer environment in early hip-hop culture, where drug dealing was not condemned but celebrated, created the perfect conditions for addiction to grow unchecked. He was addicted to cocaine, crack, marijuana, and alcohol continuously for 18 years, often using multiple substances at once. Flavor Flav admitted, "There was a time I spent between $2,400 and $2,600 a day for 6 straight years. Do the math yourself and you'll see how much money I burned on drugs. The calculation is easy. $2,500 per day, multiplied by 365 days, multiplied by 6 years, equals $5,475,000. To put this in context, the average income of a U.S. household in the year 2000 was only about $42,000 per year. At the height of his career, Flavor Flav spent the equivalent of 137 years of average U.S. household income on crack cocaine. Drugs are like a machine created by humans. At first, it is designed to serve, but when that machine turns around, slaps you and tells you what to do, there are only 2 choices: destroy it or reprogram it. Flavor Flav did neither. He let it control him. In the most bitter paradox at that exact time, Public Enemy released Night of the Living Bassheads, one of the most famous anti-drug songs in hip-hop history. The video used real cocaine addicts to illustrate the destruction of crack. Chuck D, Professor Griff, and other members openly opposed drugs, smoking, and partying. But the core member of the group was drowning in that very addiction. Instead of intervening, publicly seeking professional help, or demanding accountability, the group chose concealment. By 1991, the addiction could no longer be hidden from the law. Flavor Flav assaulted his then-girlfriend Karen Ross, the mother of his 3 children, during a rage episode tied to addiction-related behavioral disorders. He pled guilty, served 30 days in jail, and lost all custody rights. Rather than becoming a turning point toward recovery, the sentence pushed him deeper. Medical records note that after 1991, he sank further into addiction. 2 years later, he hit a new low. In 1993, Flavor Flav was involved in a shooting incident with neighbor Thaloius English, whom he believed was having an affair with his girlfriend. He was charged with attempted murder and weapons possession and received a 90-day jail sentence. That same year, additional charges piled up: domestic violence, cocaine possession, marijuana possession. But this time, the consequences led to something that had never happened before. His family staged an intervention and sent him to the Betty Ford Center, one of the most respected rehabilitation facilities in the United States. However, addiction like a ghost refused to let go. After his father's death in 1997 due to diabetes complications, Flavor Flav relapsed severely. He entered a second rehabilitation center on Long Island and was involved in a motorcycle accident that broke both of his arms. By the year 2000, after nearly 2 decades of addiction, Flavor Flav reached absolute bottom. He lived in a cramped apartment in the Bronx with Beverly Johnson and her 2 children from a previous relationship. His main source of income was selling black market tickets for baseball games at Yankee Stadium. A co-founder of one of the most influential hip-hop groups, a man who once earned millions of dollars, was now surviving through street hustles. Money, fame, assets all had been swallowed by drugs. He had no savings, no property, no legitimate employment. All that remained was a name that once stood at the peak of culture. Now wandering at society's edge, no different from a homeless man carrying the corpse of a glorious past. Chuck D and Public Enemy. The Los Angeles Relocation Movement. At the end of 2003, Flavor Flav left New York. Not a strategic move, not a carefully calculated migration. He left because he had no other choice. New York had become a space saturated with addiction triggers, a city tightly bound to a collapsing past streets, familiar with drugs, old relationships that never truly released him. Los Angeles at that time was not a promised land, but simply a place far enough away to temporarily sever the loop of self-destruction. Flavor Flav arrived in Los Angeles and stayed at the apartment of a friend nicknamed Princess, a temporary shelter in the most literal sense. Just a few months later, in a turn few could have predicted, he met Chris Abrego and Mark Cronin, creators and executive producers of the reality television series The Surreal Life on VH1. When interacting with Flavor Flav, the producers noticed something striking. He was no longer in the visibly ravaged state of an addict burning from the inside out. From their perspective, Flavor Flav appeared to have reached a certain level of stability since leaving New York, particularly after escaping his familiar drug environment. This assessment, though not medical, reflected an important reality. Geographic relocation had created an immediate and tangible impact on his behavior. In 2004, Flavor Flav appeared on Season 3 of The Surreal Life. This marked his first large-scale return to mainstream media since the late 1980s. But the significance of this appearance was not fame. What mattered more was structure. The show provided him with a clear schedule, a daily purpose, a legitimate source of income, and a defined professional role. All of these factors, from a behavioral psychology standpoint, are key protective elements against relapse. Instead of drifting, Flavor Flav was placed into a framework where he had to show up, had to complete tasks, and had to be accountable to cameras and contracts. From The Surreal Life, a chain of unforeseen consequences began to form. In 2005, Strange Love was born, following the unusual relationship between Flavor Flav and Brigitte Nielsen. The show was not designed to honor human depth. It thrived on curiosity, cultural collision, and heightened entertainment. But for Flavor Flav, Strange Love continued to provide what he had lacked for many years: steady work, stable income, and the sense that he still had a place within some kind of system. Then came Flavor of Love from 2006 to 2008, a genuine cultural phenomenon. The show achieved the highest ratings in the history of VH1 non-sports programming and delivered long-term financial stability, something music could no longer provide at that time. However, it was precisely here that the conflict between Flavor Flav and Chuck D became clearer than ever. In the eyes of Chuck D and some who were deeply tied to the Public Enemy legacy, reality television was a form of exploitation. They believed VH1 had turned Flavor Flav into a distorted image, overshadowing the political message the group had once built. But from a more pragmatic perspective, television work, however controversial, provided Flavor Flav with what the music industry no longer could: a survival system, a stable financial base, and most importantly, enough distance from crack cocaine, the substance that had nearly killed him. Even so, Los Angeles was not a miracle. In 2012, Flavor Flav was arrested in a serious domestic violence case involving his then-fiancée, Elizabeth Trujillo. The incident included allegations that he threatened her teenage son, Gibran, with a sharp weapon. This event revealed an undeniable reality. Heavy drug use may have significantly decreased, but the deep behavioral disorders and violent tendencies once amplified by addiction never truly disappeared. They merely shifted into a latent state waiting for the right moment to erupt. Alongside this ran another pattern of violations that lasted for years. Flavor Flav was repeatedly arrested for driving under the influence and driving with a revoked license. Some sources claim his license was revoked at least 43 times due to alcohol-related offenses. While that number is difficult to verify, absolutely the series of arrests in the area near Las Vegas during the period from 2014 to 2015 shows one thing clearly. Alcohol remained part of his life, even when crack cocaine no longer dominated his daily existence. He continued to drive, while intoxicated, continued to violate the law, continued to ignore legal boundaries. This is the central paradox of the Los Angeles period. On one hand, Flavor Flav had work-money media presence and appeared to have escaped the deepest pit of addiction. On the other hand, risky behavior violence and disregard for the law persisted. Geographic relocation saved him from certain deadly triggers, but it did not heal the psychological structures damaged over decades. Meanwhile, the distance between him and Chuck D and Public Enemy became increasingly visible. One side viewed reality television as a betrayal of legacy. The other saw it as the only way to survive. Neither side was entirely wrong, but neither was entirely right. Los Angeles was not just a new location. It was a symbol of an irreversible split between two people who once created one of hip-hop's most powerful political icons. One chose to protect the message. The other chose to protect his own life, even if the price was image controversy and fractures that would never fully heal. Financial scandals, child support, default and silent bankruptcy. If drugs drained Flavor Flav's vitality and honor, then the financial scandal surrounding child support exposed an even more stripped-down truth. This was no longer a story about addiction or a lost artist, but about rejected responsibility, about children existing on the margins of the spotlight of a cultural icon who once stood at the top. On July 21, 2019, Kate Gamble gave birth to her son Jordan Flavor Flav's youngest child. Unlike other private moments often shielded by fame, this case quickly entered the legal arena. Kate Gamble filed a paternity lawsuit to enforce child support obligations. The court approved and an official agreement was established. Flavor Flav was required to pay $3,000 per month to support his son. On paper, this was a reasonable figure for an artist who had once possessed millions of dollars from music, television, and touring. In reality, the agreement quickly became an empty promise. By May 2022, Flavor Flav had accumulated nearly $80,000 in overdue payments equivalent to roughly 27 months of missed child support. For nearly 2.5 years, a child grew up without receiving a single dollar from his famous father. Kate Gamble's statement to Hip Hop DX cut through every layer of neutral legal language. She stated plainly that Jordan had received no child support from Flavor Flav, while daily living costs continued to fall on her shoulders. To sustain her son's life, Kate was forced to liquidate personal assets. More bitter still, she donated part of the proceeds to a children's hospital. A paradox impossible to ignore. A mother selling personal belongings to raise her child and give to charity, while a legendary father stood behind cold debt figures. Kate Gamble's case was not an exception, but one link in a repeating pattern. Nearly a decade earlier, Flavor Flav had been involved in an even more dramatic and costly lawsuit with Angie Parker, the mother of 3 of his other children. In 2010, the court ruled in Parker's favor, ordering Flavor Flav to pay child support along with private school tuition. 2 years later, in 2012, the unpaid amount had exceeded $112,000. The court determined Flavor Flav's financial obligation at approximately $838 per week, not including tuition. These were not vague or voluntary expenses, but legal obligations clearly stated in a ruling. Yet instead of complying, Flavor Flav allowed the violations to continue until he faced the risk of being sentenced to 180 days in jail for willfully failing to meet child support orders. Confronted with the prospect of incarceration, Flavor Flav was forced to act. He appeared in court with a one-time payment of $225,000 to cover most of the outstanding debt. But even after this massive payment, he still owed an additional $1,118. As an added condition to avoid jail, Flav agreed to pay an extra $1,200 per month on top of the original obligation. Taken individually, these numbers can overwhelm an outside observer. But placed in broader context, they reveal a long-running pattern of financial recklessness. Failures to meet child support obligations occurred while Flavor Flav still had substantial income from Public Enemy royalties, reality television, and touring. From 2006 to 2008, the reality shows he participated in reached record ratings and generated significant revenue. This makes the argument of having no money difficult to sustain. Faced with these facts, only two possibilities remain. Either Flavor Flav managed his finances so poorly that he could not maintain even minimal obligations to his children, or he deliberately ignored legal responsibilities, prioritizing other needs regardless of the consequences for those dependent on him. Whichever is true, the outcome is the same. Children were not adequately supported, and mothers bore the direct consequences. The contrast becomes brutal when placed next to figures Flavor Flav himself admitted. During the peak 6 years of addiction, he spent between $5,300,000 and $5,700,000 on cocaine and crack. Money for drugs was always found. Money for his children was not. This is no longer a story about financial scarcity, but about what was prioritized and what was abandoned. Ultimately, Flavor Flav's financial scandals did not result in an official bankruptcy filing on paper, but in substance, it was a silent bankruptcy. A bankruptcy of responsibility, of personal credibility, and of the ability to sustain the role of a father. A man who once stood at the peak of popular culture, who once spent money without restraint on addiction, repeatedly failed in the most basic obligation to his own children. And in that void, the image of the star collapsed completely without the need for any further scandal to prove it. The 2017 royalty lawsuit, the fracture of Chuck D's career. In August 2017, an event that seemed impossible officially erupted. Flavor Flav filed a lawsuit against Chuck D's company, Bring the Noise, and longtime producer Gary G. Wiz Scheider. This was not an impulsive lawsuit, nor a momentary outburst from a sidelined artist. It was the result of years of accumulated pressure of numbers that did not add up, and of the feeling of being pushed aside within the very legacy he helped build. Flavor Flav's argument was presented plainly and specifically. He stated that he had participated in the creation of more than 50 Public Enemy songs, not only as a performer, but at the level of musical structure and stage energy. According to the lawsuit, for many years, he was consistently underpaid in royalties, performance fees, and merchandise revenue. One example was presented like a direct knife to the pride of a co-founder. Flavor Flav stated that he requested $75,000 to participate in a recent album project, a figure reflecting his position and history within the group. What he received was only $7,500. Not a minor discrepancy, but a tenfold difference. In statements to the press, Chuck D did not attack Flavor Flav. Instead, he said he was very disappointed, but that disappointment was directed at a series of individuals responsible for managing Public Enemy's finances. He emphasized that he was not angry with Flavor Flav. Chuck D even publicly stated that if accounting issues were not resolved by October 1, 2017, he himself would file lawsuits against the management companies involved. This statement inadvertently revealed an important truth. Chuck D did not deny the possibility of financial irregularities. He only denied his direct responsibility for them. In 2019, the court dismissed the lawsuit. On legal paper, Flavor Flav lost. But in the long arc of Public Enemy's story, the lawsuit exposed another layer of truth. If a single project contained a discrepancy of $67,500, then what had happened over decades of touring releases and business before that? The issue was no longer about one number. It was about structure, about how power and finances were operated around a collective icon. The situation did not end there. On March 1, 2020, Public Enemy announced that Flavor Flav had been fired from the group after more than 35 years of collaboration. However, on April 1, 2020, Chuck D stated that the firing was merely an April Fool's prank staged to draw attention and highlight media bias in reporting negative hip-hop stories. Flavor Flav's response, however, contradicted Chuck D's account. Rather than confirming participation in the prank, Flavor Flav stated, "I am not your employee, I am your partner. You cannot fire me." Without Public Enemy, there is no Flavor Flav, so do it right, Chuck. He also denied being a drug addict and asserted that he had been clean for 10 years. The ambiguity continued through 2025. The question remains, was the firing real and later reframed as a prank to minimize damage to the Public Enemy brand? Or was it truly just an April Fool's joke? Flav's denial of involvement in the prank suggests the first explanation may be more accurate: the remaining legacies. By 2025, Flavor Flav no longer stands at the center of the storm as he did 3 decades earlier, but he has never truly disappeared. He appears more quietly, more sober, and more cautious with the name he has carried his entire life. Flavor Flav speaks openly about sobriety from alcohol, about faith, about mistakes that carried an unbearable price, and about the desire to live long enough to repair things that money and fame can never fix. He participates in social causes and appears in institutional spaces that few once imagined someone so chaotic could ever enter. But Flavor Flav's legacy is not measured by how much he has improved. It lies in the paradox he leaves behind. A man who was once the stage soul of a great political music group, yet also a living example of the cost of indulgence addiction and talent without discipline. Flavor Flav leaves hip-hop with a model that is flawed, even dangerous, but impossible to erase. He reminds us that history is not written only by victories, but also by falls too deep to pretend never happened. And perhaps the reason his story is still told is not because he has been redeemed, but because no one can be certain whether that redemption can ever truly be complete.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your